Today we're following on from what we talked about last lesson. Hopefully you remember a couple of things, including the Schlieffen Plan, and hopefully you remember a couple of attacks on some Belgian forts by the German army as well, which is where we start our visual journey today. So here we've got Fort de Avantguin, or something rather, and this is one of those Belgian forts I told you about. Now I'm on Google Maps here, and so this is more or less the present day, which is really cool. And if you ever go to Europe and visit these places, and I highly recommend both going to Europe and visiting these sites, what struck me and what I imagine could strike you as well is how just commonplace all this stuff is. When we walk around Adelaide, we might find an old town hall, or we might find an old railway, for example, or an old jetty broken down on the beach, and we don't really think much of it. We're like, oh yeah, we used to have a jetty and now we don't, and it's broken down. The European attitude seems to be, at least from my outsider's perspective, pretty similar to do with things to do with the war. You go for a walk and out of nowhere will pop up this beautifully kept war cemetery. Or there's some old shells that have exploded and they're just lying around, around paddocks and stuff. It's crazy. So these forts are an example of that. Now here's the town of Liege, and I told you that this is an important area in Belgium for the Germans to get through. If they wanted to get to France, they had to go through Liège. And you can see all these little red dots are actually the forts surrounding Liège, which is really, really cool. And again, in World War One is pretty well the last battle in human history where fortresses played an important role. World War Two, not so much. We learnt our lesson that the nature of warfare changed. But World War One, we still had these crazy defences put in place, which is really cool. And so if you go to Belgium today, you can see all these different places hanging around there. We'll just go to one or two more before we move on, if they come back. And what you may or may not be able to see is that all of these places are actually on hills. It's hard to see from an aerial view, obviously, but they're all placed on top of hills. And remember, they've got the underground networks happening as well. So although all we can see is superficial stuff, underneath, this is probably a tunnel entry there, or even back here, I'm not really sure. But there are tunnels and storehouses here, and here's one of those areas where the cannons kind of popped out of the ground and shot onto the area surrounding. So the battles we're talking about, the stories I told you last lesson, this is exactly where it happened. And so this flatter land here was defended by these forts. Okay, let's zoom out. Let's get our bearings here. Okay, so here's Liège. As we zoom out, we'll get our bearings within Europe. And hopefully you'll start to be recognising the landforms and the countries of Europe from that map you've seen and know so well. Let's see if we can get some. Here we go. All right. So here's Germany, here's France, Belgium. Now what you'll notice over here is where we're used to seeing Austria-Hungary on our maps. We've got all these other countries here because, as I've said before, Austria-Hungary broke up at the end of World War One. That was one of the consequences of World War One. Okay, so where it stands so far, we've got Germany marching on Belgium. Now here's the French-German border along here, and this is where France had and would still have some evidence of all those forts. And so Germany are trying to get through to France through Belgium. And we remember they're doing that because they've got a huge time pressure. Instead of splitting their army in two and fighting both France and Russia, they've decided to keep their main army as one big force. And their plan, as detailed in the Schlieffen Plan, is to come through Belgium, smash France, and you can see Paris is pretty close to Belgium there, absolutely smash Paris in a matter of weeks, and then turn around, get all of its army back to the Eastern Front to fight Russia before they've had a chance to mobilise and get ready. Okay, what we want to learn about today is the Eastern Front, how that developed. So, pretty well, what happened is Germany marching through Liège, and as I told you, through the use particularly of some crazy big artillery weapons, and most notably a Big Bertha, they destroyed Liège and started marching on France. Now, really interestingly, the French army had all, were lining up along Belgium and had all their armies and all their soldiers lined up on the border. And before, just as Germany were coming into France, they actually pulled their men back by some miles or kilometers because they didn't want to be seen as the aggressor. Everyone wanted to make sure the other team looked like they were the bad guys. So what the French army did is actually pulled their soldiers back from the border and really forced Germany to look like the bad guys here. Anyway, we're going to go over this really quickly because it's really messy and it's not pivotally important. What happens is Germany's pretty well marching through here. They get into France, and they actually get within 20 miles or something of Paris. One of the soldiers reckons he could see the Eiffel Tower of Paris while they're marching there. And Paris naturally, or France naturally, sends its soldiers this way. And through a very big series of battles, we just have Germans marching and lining up here, and then the French lining up along here. And if you can picture where two rivers flowing in opposite directions might meet. If you can picture, for those of you who like Dragon Ball Z, picture Gohan and Cell or Goku and Frieza or something, chucking their Kamehamehas at each other. And where the two rivers or the two blasts meet, they're kind of going to hit each other, and then they're going to spread out. And that's exactly what happened here. As the armies were marching on each other, they met at various places along here. And once they met, they instead of just having one long column facing each other, they spread out running north-south across France. Now, as I had said a little while ago, one of the things you try and do in battle is get behind or get on the sides of your enemy, because then all of a sudden your enemy has to fight, in 2 or 3 different directions. So we had this situation where both armies were trying to what we call flank each other, trying to get around the side of each other, and they developed this big long battle line that stretched all the way pretty well across most of Europe, and that is what we call the Western Front, which is where we're going to be spending 2 or 3 lessons looking at that. Apologies for the email coming through. All right, let's jump to this map here. In fact, let's jump. All right, here's our map of the Western Front here in Europe. So what we had after a little while is the two armies met somewhere around here, and as they tried to get alongside and outflank each other, the Western Front spread all the way from the ocean up in Belgium, literally to the ocean. So we had people fighting up until the beaches, going all the way down, all the way through Belgium, into France, going all the way down through France, until eventually it stopped at Switzerland. Now the reason it stopped at Switzerland is one, because Switzerland is a neutral country and invading that would, invoke their wrath, and also because there's heaps of mountains and stuff around there, and well, mainly for the neutral run, because they did fight in some other mountains around here as well. So that we had the Western Front developing all the way from the ocean right down there to Switzerland. And as you can see here, we had different nations all lining the border here. So French here, US, which only came in 1918, very late in the war. You remember they declared themselves neutral when war broke out. And the British took up residence over here, and that's where we see lots of Australians fighting as well. The photos I showed you of the cloth hall that was destroyed were up here at Ypres, where we had heaps of Aussies fighting and dying up there. A city I stayed in for a few days when I was over there in France was here at Lille. Cool. We're going to leave it there, and we're going to hand you over to a much more experienced YouTuber. And you're going to learn a little bit more about the Western Front through a different video. Hope you're going well, grade 9s. My apologies I'm not with you there today, but I look forward to seeing you sometime soon. Catch you, folks.